the vexed and complex question of racism and nationalism. And I really appreciate their willingness to take time out of their busy schedules to talk to us and to share their insights from different parts of the discipline and different parts of the geographic dimension. So first off will be Debra Thompson, who is a professor of political science at McGill University in Montreal. She has a PhD from Toronto, previously taught at Northwestern, Oregon, and Ohio, and is the author of the award-winning book, The Schematic State, Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census. Next up will be Kimberly St. Julian-Varnon, who is a doctoral student in history at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research examines the intersections of Black experience, identity, ethnicity, race, and nationality policy in the former Soviet Union and in the post-Soviet space. And then thirdly, we will have Diego von Vacano, who is a professor of politics at Texas A&M University. He has a PhD from Princeton. He's the author of The Color of Citizenship, Race, Modernity, and Latin American Hispanic Political Thought. Also of the book Art of Power, Machiavelli, Nietzsche, and the Making of Aesthetic Political Theory. And with Kazuko Suzuki, he is the editor of Reconsidering Race, Social Science Perspectives on Racial Categories in the Age of Genomics. And Diego is also editor of a book series on studies in comparative political theory for OUP, Oxford University Press. So I've asked the speakers to speak initially for 10 minutes each, one after the other. And the audience, you are welcome to use the Q&A function through Zoom to log your questions, and I'll be scanning those questions. And then when the 30 minutes or so of presentations are up, I will then switch to drawing out questions from the audience, and then the panelists will also have a chance to ask questions of each other and to engage in a debate. And we will finish promptly at 2:30 Eastern Time. So I will hand the floor over to Debra to take us off.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So we only have 10 minutes, so I am going to make 3 main points. The first point I would like to make is that race as a concept is really about relations of power. So scholars of race talk about race as a modern invention. It emerged at the same time as the first formations of the modern nation state and the rise of global capitalism. So for most of its history, race has been understood as being fundamentally biological in nature. This is wrong, but for most of its history, that's how we thought about race. So the physiological and morphological characteristics like skin color, like eye shape and size, like hair texture, these were considered to be the telltale characteristics that differentiated races from one another. Importantly, races were seen as being determinative, so our moral worth and human potential were thought to be linked to racial identities, and race alone could account for every type of discrepancy in attitude, ability, and achievement. Different races were believed to be able to be ranked according to strength, intelligence, ability, temperament, historical triumphs, capacity, and these rankings always fictitiously confirm the supremacy of people who identified as white. So nowadays, we know that there's nothing biological about race. Race is best understood as a social construction. Race exists because we made it up. It's like currency or reputation. And we know, for example, that there's more genetic variation among those people that self-identify as Black as there is between people who identify as Black and people who identify as white. And there's been a lot of really great studies recently in sociology. I'm thinking of the work by Wendy Roth, for example, that demonstrates that those DNA tests, like by ancestry.com or 23andMe, those DNA tests allow people to choose selectively from the results, enabling them to embrace parts of their identity that they want and ignore those that are deemed as less desirable. And Kim Tallbear has done a lot of really interesting work on this, of the dangers of DNA that DNA tests pose to Indigenous populations. So as a social construction, race is tied up with boundary making processes. So it's about the creation of categories, classifications, and taxonomies. The most important thing about races is the boundary between them. And these boundaries have been policed in a number of ways, often by the state, and yet they've always been both porous and temporally and spatially contingent. And Laura Stoller once wrote that the fixity of racial categories can never really contain the fluidity of their content. So rather than thinking about race as a biological or a social construct, I think that we need to think about race as a relationship of power. So if we believe that race is a social construct, then even something like skin color is part of the social construction itself, right? So skin color just is this privileged metonym for the larger idea of race, which is actually about power. It's about the ability to invest morphology with meaning. So the second point I want to make is that as a relationship of power, race is created through different kinds of social and legal practices. So racism, therefore, isn't just about individual attitudes or abhorrent individual behavior. Racism is better defined as a social, legal, economic, and political distinctions that mark and maintain unequal access and entry points to property, privacy, protection, prosperity, and personhood. Racism is embedded in structures and institutions and ideas, especially those ideas about hard work, deservedness, representation, redistribution, and the proper role of government. And because race is so deeply entrenched in social structures and institutions, this means that as actors and agents, we don't actually need to do anything to take part in racialized social systems. But it also means that we can empirically examine indicators of racialization and the social and legal practices that work to produce conceptions of race. And this enables us to compare between different places. So Melissa Weiner wrote an article a few years ago now in Sociology Compass, I think it's called Global Critical Race Theory, in which she talks about these different racial practices. And I'm just going to name a few of them. So one, we can think of citizenship laws, the institutional barriers and social practices that work to include or exclude different individuals or groups. We can also think about ambiguous citizens like colonial immigrants or internal colonial subjects. Two, we can think of the state control of different populations, those populations that are more likely to be surveilled and profiled. Here we can think of voter ID laws or police stops. Three, we can think of external ascription and boundary permeability. So who exerts the power to create racial categories and taxonomies in institutions like the census? And this is what my book was on. Four, criminalization. So which groups are most closely policed, which are the targets of search and arrest, which are overrepresented in prisons or sentenced to death more often. Five, geography and spatial segregation. So institutions like apartheid, ghettoization, gentrification, the entire creation of the American suburbs, or ideas of homelands. We can also think about which spaces are limited by access to resources, like which spaces don't have access to clean drinking water, social services, jobs, education, or livable housing. Six, socioeconomic status, so unequal access to power and resources that structure opportunities and produce inequalities in terms of jobs, education, health, income, wealth, and occupational attainment. And also, finally, another social practice that produces race is just popular images, discourse, symbols, flags, Confederate monuments, these types of everyday interactions which shape our ideas of race. Okay, so the third point I want to make with the few minutes I have left is that one of the ways that we can conceptualize race is as a transnational concept that exists beyond the control of any one nation state. So race was born in the transnational realm, and it was bred to be central to the discourses and practices of empire, nation state formation, and the evolution of the modern capitalist system. And to think about race as transnational doesn't mean that domestic manifestations of racism don't matter. It doesn't mean that racism operates in the same way in different places, but rather the trans in transnational implicates the importance of movement and the ways that ideas and people change as they're in motion, the ways that some ideas are so profound that they resonate across the globe, like we've recently seen with Black Lives Matter. So for African descended populations, which is a population group that I now study, the transnational nature of our identities is captured in the idea of diaspora, which I know is familiar to many of you who study nationalism. So diaspora being the dispersal of a population from its place of origin and the subsequent mythologization of the homeland as populations relocate elsewhere. So the African diaspora, of course, originates in the traumatic, violent, forced departure of the transatlantic slave trade, and it manifests through contemporary imagined relationships to the continent of Africa as the motherland for African descended populations around the world. So the original violence of the Middle Passage still remains, but the African diaspora also represents the various attempts of Black people to find peace, safety, and redemption in a return to Africa, and the transnational circulation of ideas and activists as they engage in various struggles towards emancipation, autonomy, and self-determination. So diaspora, it seems like it's all about violence, but it's also very productive. It's a productive conception of identity. And I think of a diaspora as akin to 4 different sets of practices. And here I'm drawing from scholars like Michael Hanchard, who has written so much on this, Tina Kampt, who writes on Black people in Germany, Brent Hayes Edwards, and Debra Thomas. So diaspora first can refer to various connections that African descended populations feel because of our common sense of history, imagined homeland, folklore, cultural symbols, experiences of racial subjugation, and the intangible sense that somehow our fates are linked together, even in disparate places around the globe. Second, we can think of diaspora as those ruptures that differentiate Black experiences between different countries. So, being Black in Canada is different than being Black in the US, but that also reveals local and regional formations of identity. So as somebody who's lived in, for example, Chicago and then Eugene, Oregon, being Black in Chicago is very different than being Black in Eugene, Oregon. We also here can pay attention to the complicated intersections of racial identity with like gender identity and expression, sexuality, class, legal status, and the ways that these actually create varying levels of privilege and vulnerability even within Black communities. Third, we can think of diaspora as translations that occur when people and ideas move across time and space, including all that is lost in translation and that which is just untranslatable. We can also think about the ways that the state and other institutions work to mediate these transnational ideas of race with domestic manifestations of racism or racial projects of the state. And finally, we can think of diaspora in the way that it takes the form of comparisons between racial identities or the racial formations in different places that serve as lessons or warnings, taking heed of the different relationships of power that actually shape Black politics in any domestic context. And here we can think about the way that, for example, the United States has an oversized influence in the formation of Black cultural identity. We can also think about American exceptionalism, which Americans often interpret as being American democratic exceptionalism, the way that America positions itself as being the world's oldest, best, most robust democracy, but the ways that the rest of the world sees American exceptionalism often in terms of its racial exceptionalism, which is to say that the US tends to be exceptionally racist, and the ways that the rest of the world views that racism as warnings or uses the American racism to deny, in some cases, the existence of racism in its own domestic context. And that's it for me.
Great, Deborah. Thanks for that terrific overview, covering so much material in such a short time. And now we'll pivot to Houston, Texas, to have Kimberly's contribution.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to our wonderful panel. So I'm looking at this from a little bit different perspective as a historian and as an African-American woman from the South who works on Soviet and Russian and Ukrainian history. And so I'll kind of discuss my research, and then I'll talk a little bit about the discourses that we have in the field in terms of the history of racism and race in the Soviet Union and in Russia. And then if I have time, I'll go into some of the things we kind of lose sight of in our pursuit of history and of writing the history of the Soviet Union. My work uses Black experience, both African-American and African experiences in the Soviet Union from the 20s through the 80s probably, to gauge understandings of race in the Soviet Union, to look at ideas of ethnicity, but also to kind of understand the efficacy of Soviet nationality policy. We often see this state as a monolith in Soviet history. And so what I have always been drawn to is individual experience and how Soviet citizens worked within these ideas of policy, but also of nationality. And so that's where I kind of situate my work. But I also like to look at the other side of this coin in terms of what does it mean to be Black in a place that is anti-racist, in a place that legally does not see race. Race is not a category by which people can identify themselves in the Soviet Union. And so I look at how African Americans in particular who are leaving the Jim Crow South, how they start to define and tinker with ideas of African American identity. Can you be Black in a place that does not officially engage in white supremacy? And we start seeing some very interesting, conclusions from what people have drawn. And their ability to do this is definitely based on other, capacities besides their skin color. We have artists like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay who've been in the Soviet Union, but we also have regular people who went to the Soviet Union as workers or to visit. And so we have this idea of a Blackness that can be tinkered with and redefined outside of white supremacy. And what they are able to do is really interesting. So that's kind of what I do in the work that I've done in my current project. But thinking about race and discourse in Soviet history and Imperial Russian history, we do have multiple figures who've written about it. Alison Blakely, the first African-American to earn a PhD in the field, he wrote a book about, Russia and the Negro and, Black people in Russian thought, which kind of, for me, set the stage for understanding that, yes, there are people of color in Russia. And then we have a lot of recent work, especially in sociology and anthropology, that is doing some really interesting ideas of challenging the ideas of the sociology of race. Jeff Zahedayev's book looks at Central Asian migrants and how they understand color, but also privilege. And we have Nikolai Zakharov, who wrote a magnificent book that looks at race and racism in modern Russia. And he's kind of using his work to introduce Russia as a place where we can actually study race and racism. And that kind of deals with some of these ideas that we see in popular space and in discourses about race in Russia, that race doesn't exist in Russia, or racism, it doesn't exist, or that studying race in Russia isn't productive because it's such a unique place when it comes to its history of people of color, particularly African Americans and Africans. But what we see as we do more of this work is that we should see Russia as a very good place for comparison. If we look at how racism has developed and has spread in Russia, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, we have some interesting comparisons with the United States. And that kind of helps us move away from this idea of, American exceptionalism and race that we have heard of. And so I want to dig into these things and really talk about what did race mean? Besides the biological idea, we still have people in the Soviet Union and in the post-Soviet space who are defining race in interesting ways. They might not be biological, but they are still engaging with racial ascription of people who are not Slavic in general. And so especially in Russia now, we see people who are called people of non-Slavic race. And that has actually led to some of the more violent race riots you've seen in Russia, especially in 2010, where a person was arrested for attacking a Russian, soccer fan, and he was described as a person of non-Slavic descent. And so that led to people from the Caucasus and from Central Asia being attacked by not just skinheads, but different types of people in Moscow because of that description. But we still have these racial descriptions, even though race still isn't, a codifier in Russian legal and government parlance. So in terms of the field, I think we do have a good amount of work being done in sociology and anthropology. Political scientists doing some interesting work. In history, besides Blakely and Sahadeo, David Rainbow wrote a really great collected edition that talks about race in different forms, not just the African-American or African experience, but also a lot of these pieces discuss Roma and the Jewish experience, because Russia, as much as it kind of seems like it's this predominantly Slavic country, has over 100 ethnic minorities. It's a very diverse place, which also makes me, as an American, as an African-American, think this is a perfect place to look at these examples and compare racism and prejudice and ideas of ethnicity, because we have a country that is so diverse, much like the United States. In terms of what we failed to address, I think that, especially in my field, we tend to treat archival sources as the end all be all for our work, and especially because the Soviets had so many archival research, archival documents, you want to get through those. But the issue is, when we do focus on these archival resources and archival primary sources, we're still kind of letting the state to shape the narratives that we're writing. But when you have a country like the Soviet Union that does not have a legal definition of race, where people are not, organized by race, if you don't see that in the archives, what stories are you erasing? What experiences are you erasing? And that is why I like to focus on memoirs and interviews and lived experiences, because when we don't allow race to be seen in legal documents, you are still missing a very important part of the Soviet experience. And also, what that speaks to is these issues of what is representative in our sources. And that speaks to this idea where there aren't many people of color in Russia or in the Soviet Union, so why write about them? But the fact that there aren't that many people could speak to these greater issues that we've seen in Soviet history. But also it sheds light on the importance of Soviet internationalism. The treatment of African students in the Soviet Union in the 60s speaks to greater ideas of the shortcomings of Soviet nationality policy and the shortcomings of Soviet colorblindness. And another aspect that I have seen as a scholar of color in the field is that it is very difficult to be a person of color, to do research in this field, and to be a person of color who writes about people of color in this field. And for the longest time, I only focused my work on Ukraine because I did not want the stigma of being a Black person who writes about Black people in Russia. And what's been interesting is a lot of people think of me as an American historian. My training is in Soviet and Eastern European and European history. I take very seriously my training in Soviet and Russian and Ukrainian history. And because of my experiences in the field doing research in Ukraine, I own that identity. But also because there are so few of us in the country, it's very important for me that we do have that representation. If you think about what it means to be a person of color in this field, oftentimes when it comes to doing research, we have to put ourselves in physical danger to be able to do the research that our work requires. When I was in Ukraine, I had to prepare myself and prepare my family for any eventuality. And so for me, when I come into my work, I really do want to understand, what was it like before? What was it like for African Americans and for African students who saw the Soviet Union as a place that was relatively, a utopia, especially for African Americans? When you get to leave racial oppression and just go out into the street and dance with people of different colors and of different races, people were able to experience that and to talk about that. And for me, I do want to understand this trajectory. How did we go from this in the 20s and 30s to now, where if I go to Moscow for research, I'm not going out at night by myself. I'm not going outside of centralized Moscow, right? This is in a 70-year period where we see these magnificent changes. And I think getting into the history of the Soviet policy and Soviet understandings of ethnicity and race is really what's going to help us understand what we're seeing in this phenomenon of, racism and nationalism in Russia. Finally, in terms of misconceptions and thoughts, there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to Russia and to race. On both sides, and both American understandings of Russia and also Russian understandings of America. When a person of color speaks about issues of race and racism in Russia and in Ukraine, in my personal experience, you get the reaction, that's just xenophobia. It's because you're foreign. It's not because of your skin color. But what's interesting to me is there are African Americans or Afro-Russians or Afro-Ukrainians, and these people are still denied their space in the nation. And there's a lot of great work coming out. Sloan.ru had an interesting article about this. The Calvert Journal had an interesting article about Afro-Russians and their experiences and why many of them want to leave Russia. Because at the end of the day, despite being born and raised in Russia, speaking Russian, they are denied the specific aspects of nationality and nation that they get to enjoy if they were Slavic. They still can go out at night. And so they're never quite Russian enough. Their parents don't understand them. Their grandparents don't understand them. And these lived experiences are incredibly important, but also it speaks to the fact that you can have xenophobia in a country, but also have racism. And sometimes those go hand in hand. But speaking about racism in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet space, for some people, it seems like you're talking negatively about the country, or you're making it seem like they aren't Western enough or civilized enough. But honestly, speaking from personal experience and research, it appears that this, perfluence of racism and of issues of race, it very much means you are Western. And this is very much a part of Western civilization that we have seen in Western Europe right now with the protests going on to what's going on now and in Canada. These racial issues that we're seeing coming to a head in the BLM protests across the world speak to what are the foundations of Western civilization and what role do race and racism play in those? And so that's what I had for you today. I hope you've learned something from me and I didn't speak too quickly. Thank you.
No, that was all very clear, and thanks for bringing up Black Lives Matter explicitly, because we all know that's why we're here. And I thought there was a fascinating contrast there between Debra's presentation of a kind of highly socially structured racism based in deep history of social institutions, and a very nice contrast with the Soviet case, where you had the state institutions, equally powerful institutions, but not structured around race. So it's really fascinating mirror image that you've presented to us there. And then we'll pivot to Diego von Bacano, whose work is focused on Latin America, where again, the relationship between the state and race is coming from a different direction.
Thanks, Peter. So thanks everybody for being here. Can everybody hear me? Well, can you, Peter?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm going to refer to just, those were excellent presentations from Debra and Kimberly. From Kimberly's perspective, I find it interesting that we have to think about non-US cases. So again, this is something that I'm very sympathetic with. We have to think of race as something that of course happens outside of the US. We shouldn't think that the US is exceptional. It's something that also Debra said, right? We tend to think that the US is somehow preeminent in everything. We have to question that. We have to question everything, including in academia. We often use American paradigms, American models to think about cases outside of the US. And this has been, in my view, the case about racial studies, often including, for example, thinking about race in the US is often translated into models that are applied in France or perhaps Argentina, Mexico, etc., without looking at the local context. So I think it's really important to think that the US is just one country among many. It's not the preeminent country in everything. And race exists in different ways in different places in the world, right? So we shouldn't assume there's one universal way of thinking about race. So coming from the Latin American perspective, as I'm a political theorist of Latin America, but I've began my career as a historian of ideas of European political thought. I think it's important to break those boxes of thinking that the US and Europe are dominant even again in theoretical paradigms. So my own trajectory is one in which I began my work at Wesleyan University, first on Marxism, then I did my dissertation on Machiavelli and Nietzsche. And of course, these are not really Latin American concepts, but when I began teaching at Williams College, I realized that one of the dominant themes of Latin American political thought is race. And once you delve into these topics, you realize that, I realize anyway, that there's a lot of commonalities between Latin American cases and the US. That's something that I slowly kind of realized over a 10-year period. And so the way that I think of going back to a little bit to what Peter said about Black Lives Matter, is that when we think about race in the US, we shouldn't think of it only as exceptional, but there are some parallels and similarities with Latin American cases in my view, in the way that race is understood or treated. What I'm trying to say today is that let's think of the US as perhaps one case of many American cases. In other words, the Americas is the Western Hemisphere. And going back a little bit to what Kimberly was saying, that this is a Western culture phenomenon, right? This Western civilization notion can be quite different from what happens in the former Soviet Union or the USSR. So in the history of the Western Hemisphere, I think that there's a lot of commonalities between Latin America and North America, especially the US. I don't know much about Canada, but in the case of the US and Latin America, we have both societies that are post-colonial, that are post-slavery, that are also, perhaps you might call them frontier societies in which there was a conquest of the West in some way, right? By kind of a white man's burden idea. You can see this very clearly in Argentina, for instance. One of the preeminent thinkers of Argentina is Sarmiento. And Sarmiento, when you read Sarmiento's analysis of the gauchos, for instance, it's very similar to the cowboys in Texas or in the West. It's a very similar conception. So those are strong similarities. And one of the outcomes of these kind of structural similarities between North America and South America or Latin America is that in the post-Republican period, historically, when nations became slowly detached from the imperial powers, republics emerged. And in those republics, because of weak institutions, strong leaders emerged, caudillos. They're called caudillos in Latin America, strongmen, basically. And these strongmen in Latin America often emerged when there were many different ethnic or regional groups competing for power. And the only way to prevent them from being, from descending into anarchy or civil war was to have one strong ruler, one dominant sort of strongman to maintain power through personalism, force, and personal connections, really. And so that to avoid a descent into civil war. And this is quite common in many of the countries that I've studied in the history of political thought. In some of my research, I've studied Venezuela and Argentina. And the more I read into this, I realized that in the US, we've had similar cases such as Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, and you may be guessing where I'm going. And Donald Trump is really, in a sense, the culmination of this caudillo strongman tendency in the US that is, again, similar to Latin America, as a leader that somehow stands outside of institutional mechanisms with a claim that the only thing that prevents anarchy, especially due to racial and ethnic dynamics in a country, is the presence of this one strong man, right? So in general, this tends to be a man. There are some cases of strong women in Latin America. Eva Perón, I think, would be considered, should be considered one. And even going back a little bit more in the Hispanic tradition, Queen Isabel in Spain, the way that, for example, the way that he's portrayed in historiography and even in some references by Machiavelli of her, I think should qualify as somebody who's really a kind of a strong leader. So again, this notion that in order to avoid ethnic anarchy and racial strife, we need one strong leader is something that kind of recurs in the Americas generally. In Latin America, quite obviously. And my current project is to show that, well, this seems to be also a kind of latent idea in the US and culminating in what we have now. So going back a little bit, looking from the present backwards, I think the situation of race and nationalism in the US is one in which, again, as a reaction to the presidency of Barack Obama, there's been a cultural response, in a sense, by some people who are afraid of change, demographic change in the US, and that has led to this notion that we must do almost anything in order to prevent this cultural transformation. So in some way, I think nationalism in the US now is very closely tied to a kind of also cultural reaction. We shouldn't think of nationalism as only a political program in some sense, as a kind of organized, well thought out program, but it's also connected to cultural phenomena that are a little bit difficult to ascertain, especially in political science. So perhaps sociology and other disciplines might be more helpful to understand how is it that cultural phenomena can affect politics and vice versa. So that's one of the biggest puzzles I think that we have now. And in political theory, my own sense is that perhaps one of the few theorists that really captures this idea is Nietzsche. I mean, having read Nietzsche early on in my career, I think basically Nietzsche argues that politics is cultural and culture is political. So again, in my current project, in a sense, I begin with that. I begin with this idea that let's think of politics as something outside of the institutional, and let's think of it as cultural. And so if we do this, then we realize that we have to think about the specific cultures in given geographic locations. Culture, of course, is not the same everywhere. And this is something that I'm trying to do in my work generally in comparative political theory. Right? I think political theory generally tends to be very universalistic. We tend to think of political theory as something that applies everywhere equally. I don't think that's the case at all, right? We have to think about geographic locations. And in the case of the Americas, let's look at history. So I think that, I don't think political theory should be done without historical attention, right? We should think about historical trajectories, genealogies. And so that's why looking at the notion of race in Latin America in my second book project, I agree with Debra that really race in the West is a product of power. It's a product of imperial conditions and paradigms. And in the case of Latin America, Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who went to Latin America in the early 1500s, in my view, in the history of political thought, really creates this new paradigm of thinking about race in Latin America. So Latin America has a particular way of thinking about race that's very different from the North American or European or perhaps Asian ways of thinking about race. So I just want to emphasize again that different geographic locations have different paradigms of race. I do agree that race is transnational, but I think we have to give a special attention to specific locales. And so again, in my work, I begin with Las Casas. The most relevant moment perhaps for this particular topic today in my work, in the case of Venezuela, race was really fundamental in creating the nation state in the early 1800s. So people like Simón Bolívar explicitly talks about race as a necessary factor in distinguishing Venezuela from other states in Latin America, Colombia, etc. And so Venezuela has to have its own state because it's kind of ethnically and racially distinct from other parts of Latin America. At the same time, Bolívar and some of his followers like Lanz, L-A-N-Z, argue that the only way to prevent anarchy is to have a strongman. So this idea of racial diversity and conflict in Latin America goes hand in hand with the notion of a strongman as necessary. Some of the thinkers have called it a necessary gendarme, almost like a policeman who has to maintain control over this almost spiraling civil war. So again, in Venezuela's one case, the one that I'm perhaps more familiar with personally is Bolivia. I'm from Bolivia originally. And in the same sense, race has been pivotal in Bolivia's construction of national identity, not only in the initial years of 1825, also with its war against Paraguay and the Chaco War in the early 20th century, and perhaps even more so now with the history of Evo Morales in Bolivia and his effort to have a kind of a new, Bolivia is actually refounded by Evo Morales. Bolivia after 2009 is officially a kind of a different country from before. It was a republic before 2009, and now it's a plurinational state. And so Bolivia is, in a sense, Morales said that, well, Bolivia doesn't have a single nationalism or nationality. It has many nationalities, and we have to refound the state. And of course, a lot of people, they don't like that. And some people were in agreement. And now, as you may know from the recent news, is that he was forced out of office. He fled to Mexico. There was almost a civil war in Bolivia. So while a lot of people supported this idea of refounding Bolivia, a lot of people rejected it. So it's been very contentious as well. It's something that goes back all the way to 1825 in Bolivia, and it's still coming back again. Bolivia has elections in September, and they may be pushed back. But again, nationalism has returned, and both in stories against the refounding of Bolivia and in favor, race is really central in this story. So again, the Latin Americas, it's quite obvious to me that race is central to the making of the nation. And the US has become, in a sense, a reflection of that. The US as I said before, has a lot of similar structural factors to Latin America. And people often ask, why could somebody like President Trump emerge? Why did he emerge? Some people make it, they may say that, well, it's an exception, it's kind of a blip. Maybe President, Joe Biden may be the president next time and things will go back to normal. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I also don't think that President Trump is stupid. I think he's been able to manage his image quite well in a way that has kind of reshaped politics. And again, the last point I want to make is that this goes back again to one of the key points that Machiavelli says, that politics is about appearances and images. And that's something that race is, of course, something is a case of that, but also the way that the leader has to manage appearances in order to attract support. And I think we're seeing that right now.
Great, thank you, Diego. And I think the Caudillo model is something that we can all chew on. And I was thinking, of course, as you were talking, of Vladimir Putin, because as Kimberly said, Russia is multi-ethnic. It's less multi-ethnic than the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was 53% ethnic Russian. The Russian Federation is 80 to 82% ethnic Russian. But Putin, his rise to power was very much dealing with the Chechen insurgency. And so his justification for being the Caudillo was that he's the guy who can calm down the North Caucasus. And it remains the case that he does talk the talk about Russia as a multi-ethnic society. He doesn't like the word multicultural because that's too Western sounding, but he does talk about it as being multi-ethnic. Although, of course, at the same time, he talks about Russian people in an ethnic sense. So I'd like to throw that question to Debra, the question of the Caudillo model, because one of the Q&A questions asked Debra a question about democracy, about how you see, yes, it's about power and it's about a certain group being in power, but what's your assessment of the chances in the US or in Canada, for that matter, of the ethnic minorities getting a share of the power and therefore redefining the power structure? And was it inevitable that Barack Obama would be followed by Donald Trump?
Yeah, let's just start with that light, easy question. Like many of you, I was teaching when Donald Trump was elected, and I had to teach the day after the election. And I was actually I had a course. I was at Northwestern at the time, and I had a course on Black Lives Matter. And my students were so upset. They were crying, and many of the students were Black, but not all of them. And they were so surprised. And my response to them was kind of like, what country do you think you live in? Like Donald Trump to me always seemed to be a very real possibility. And like Diego said, not a blip, but rather the manifestation of like the real racial resentment that has existed in the US for the entirety of American history. So in terms of democracy, I think this is a really interesting question. And I'm going to give an answer that is not super popular. But, work on Black political thought in the US has often questioned the means by which Black Americans will be able to access, democratic institutions and democratic norms. But I'm always reminded of what James Baldwin asked, which is, is democratic inclusion worth the price of the ticket? Right. Before his death, Martin Luther King is said to have remarked or to question whether or not inclusion in a burning house is really the inclusion that we're interested in. So I think that the struggles around voting rights are really important. I think that the efforts to achieve descriptive representation in the halls of government are really important. But racism and the ways which it operates can't just be absolved through democratic incorporation, right? Through a real, like if we thought about democracy as not just kind of these formal modes of inclusion in terms of representation and even redistribution, we thought about democracy as being like the real robust sense of like the proliferation of democratic norms of equality, egalitarianism, equal moral worth, right? If we think about democracy as being kind of bigger and broader than just formal representation or formal inclusion, then we might have a chance at something that looks a little bit more equal than that which we've experienced recently. But the problem is that like those formal norms, those formal institutions of democracy really do, I think, they really do take attention away, you know, like, and so this is part of the reason why, you know, part of the arguments around Black Lives Matter is, yeah, like, sure, like more Black cops would be great, but that the police are still going to be a fundamentally like racist institution, right? More Black cops aren't going to change the fundamental nature of the police, right? Just in the same way that Black mayors don't absolve like cities of the very real like racial formations and racial inequalities that exist often at that local level, right? The types of structural changes that are required in places like the United States go much deeper than a shifted democratic institutions would enable.
Great. I don't know if Diego or Kimberly want to follow up on that, or if I can ask another question.
Can I just say something very quickly? I mean, I think it is interesting, as Debra said, that I'm thinking about Bolivia. When she said the US, these changes have to be very deep. In Bolivia's recent history, I think with Evo Morales making, you know, sort of structural changes, which were initially very popular in the first, let's say, 10 years or so, there was a reaction in the last 5 years. So that in a way, you know, we should always expect a reaction from the other side, which could erase those structural, I mean, or could mitigate those structural changes. So, you know, we should be aware that even structural change can actually lead to a very negative counter reaction.
Yeah, okay, we have quite a few questions for Kimberly based on her unique fieldwork experiences. So somebody would like to know, you know, how does Ukraine compare with Russia in terms of the African, Afro-American experience today? And also somebody asked about the position of the Orthodox Church on the race issue, if they've had any influence one way or the other.
In terms of the differences in treatment of like Afro-Russians, Afro-Ukrainians, and from my own personal experience in Ukraine, so I was relieved to be able to do research in Ukraine versus in Russia, because I was going to be doing my fieldwork in 2013, and Russia had a confluence of very violent racial attacks against people from the North Caucasus and Central Asia in the 2010s. I think I was reading over 177 attacks have happened against people of color in Russia since 2010. And so from my experience and from research, Russia seems to have more of these issues with violence against people of color in Ukraine. That also, I think, plays into what Putin has done in his reign. Is depending on where he is, he does ally himself with these very nationalist groups, or if he isn't vocal about it, you have them not arresting groups of skinheads and groups of white supremacists who are, you know, engaging in these violent activities against people. In terms of the Russian Orthodox Church, that you do have some leaders in the Orthodox Church in Russia who are very nationalistic. And so there's a piece I'm writing right now that kind of looks at these strange connections between the ultra-right Christians in America and the ultra-right Orthodox in Russia, and this kind of confluence of this idea of Russia as like a white paradise, and how these religious people are playing into that. So I don't see like direct connections between like Russian Orthodox leaders, you know, proclaiming that these violent attacks are okay. But if you push an idea of nationalism that is based on an idea of Slavic ideas that are white, you will see this reaction. Like when we talk about these changes that Diego discussed, when you have structural changes, there is that response. And I mean, I'm thinking in terms of what the Soviet Union promoted versus what is happening in Russia now, that's very much a response to the idea of anti-racism, is this promotion of racial violence.
Yeah, the reaction in Russia and many other former Soviet countries to Black Lives Matter was quite striking. It was very different from most other countries in that the liberal wing of the intelligentsia was not overwhelmingly, not uniformly sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's some strange reconfigurations going on. Another question from the panel, which again, I think we could start off with Debra, is the question of immigration, right? You talked about diaspora, but we also see other horizontal movements of people, which is often a trigger towards xenophobia. But how do you see the immigration dynamics playing out with the dynamics of racial categorization? And obviously that's something which, as Diego points out, evolves over time in the sense of, well, you can fill in the blanks yourself, Debra.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting. So the countries that I study mostly Canada, the US, and the UK. And so the interesting thing, at least about Canada and the US, is that until the 1960s, as many of you know, those countries had a white-only immigration policy, or at least employed very real racial restrictions. And so some of the racial diversity that we now see in these countries is really the result of a post-1965, 67 shift in immigration policy to a more neutral or race-neutral, superficially race-neutral immigration policies that have resulted in like incredible changes in the demographic shape of these countries. Britain's a little bit different in that the first foray into immigration policy really happened in the post-war era. But also, I think there's an argument to be made that was a direct result of former, populations of the empire deciding to take Britain up on its offer of empire and settle in Great Britain, much to the surprise and I think panic of many people in Britain at the time. But now these three countries that I study are incredibly diverse. And I think that's had a number of really interesting results. One is that in the US, for example, the black-white binary that has defined a lot of American history, it's challenging whether or not we can continue to talk about it in those terms. And the work of the sociologists like Frank Bean and Jennifer Lee, to me, kind of demonstrate that rather than thinking about just a dualism of Black people and white people, we do need to adopt a different, not just a different taxonomy, but a different way of thinking about racial inequality that can conceptualize the differential experiences of various, racial and ethnic groups in the United States. In Canada, because race has never really taken hold as a concept, Canadians, if there's any Canadians watching, they're gonna be mad at this, but like Canadians never want to talk about race or racism. There's a large sense that racism just doesn't exist in the country, even though it very clearly does in a lot of socioeconomic indicators. But Canadians would much rather talk about ethnicity and multiculturalism than race and racism. And so the new demographic patterns I think we've seen are creating different forms of politics. And of course, really different, interesting relationships, especially in North America, in terms of the ways we think about the roles of Indigenous populations, right? In some ways, we are all settlers together and therefore need to come to terms with our roles in ongoing subjugation of Indigenous populations and invest in a politics that is not simply anti-racist, but is also decolonial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it always struck me that a big difference for the African-American community and the other communities is that the immigration narrative in the US didn't apply to them because they were forced to come here, whereas the other ethnic groups could kind of buy into the narrative, at least in the imagined community level, that their ancestors kind of chose to come here for the opportunities. So that was one way that the cultural binary kind of was reinforced over the years.
Agree. And the way that has also been mobilized against Black people in the United States and elsewhere, right? So the idea that immigrants have, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and the ways that that discourse has worked to create, to invigorate white hostility towards African Americans. There's also really interesting new politics happening. So if anyone's on Twitter, the American Descendants of Slavery movement is really interesting. It's a loose online organization of Black people who, in contrast to many Black public opinions around immigration, are kind of decidedly anti-immigrant, in part because the new discourse around reparations has created a bunch of questions around who exactly would be able to get those reparations. And the ADOS group is pretty insistent that those reparations be available to people who can directly trace their lineage to American slavery, rather than the kind of the newer waves of Black immigration that have emerged in the United States since the 1960s.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions addressing the question of kind of taxonomies and criteria for drawing these group boundaries. And, in the part of the world that the ASN focuses on, Eurasia and Central Eastern Europe, the predominant tools of demarcation are linguistic and cultural and religious, and only in certain specific cases, such as the Roma or the Jews, are kind of racial categories invoked. And in all the different parts of the world that the people around this table study, the relationship between the racist, the racial narrative with other ways of ethnic identification are different. So I don't know if any of you would like to talk about that, and about how the academic community can kind of clearly articulate the role of race in the way that ethnic groups demarcate themselves. And Diego, I know it's a very complex fusion model in Latin America, or can you summarize the place of race in the demarcation of the groups there?
Yeah, that's the first thought I had is actually thinking about as you said, the present time Black Lives Matter and the COVID situation. As everybody knows, COVID has affected different racial ethnic groups differently, and I think in a sense maybe we might be at a threshold from now on. These two movements, these two events of 2020 may change a lot of the ways that we think about race. So I think one of the current ways that I think is really necessary for us to think is about, again, the intersection between genetics, the arguments about genetics and medicine, genomics, and race. I think maybe as people study the effects of COVID on different ethnic groups and racial groups, maybe that will be used to demarcate groups differently in the coming years. That's more maybe perhaps in the US, but I think that's something that I think is very interesting, how genomics has been used to think that we need new paradigms of race, even though, of course, race is socially constructed. So again, the work of Kazuko Suzuki and our edited volume was mostly sociologists. I mean, I think in political science, we're really lagging behind on that. But going back to your question about demarcating ethnic or racial groups in Latin America, I think generally, I mean, just to, if I could generalize, first of all, I mean, of course, every country is different. That's something that we have to keep in mind, that even countries like Bolivia and Peru that may seem similar have very, very different political histories. And so going back to the initial point, I mean, these are largely political constructs. So not only are they socially constructed, but I think even more specifically, as Debra said, political constructs. So we have to look at the political circumstances of different countries. I don't know if there's any way to generalize, again, general tendencies for all of Latin America. But this, countries that have larger indigenous communities like Bolivia, Guatemala, parts of Mexico will have a completely different dynamic, let's say, from more supposedly immigrant countries like Chile or Argentina. So I think maybe that's one important divide to think about the role and political power of indigenous communities in certain places. Like, again, for example, lithium is very abundant in parts of Chile, in those parts, they're local indigenous communities and they're being displaced or abused. So again, and that's going to be interesting to compare to, for instance, the lithium industry in Bolivia as it develops now in very different political circumstances.
So if I could jump in there, in part because my first book was on the politics of the census in Canada and the US and the UK. And one of the things that I found in doing the comparison between those countries is the census is one of these like very clear institutions that's involved in race making, right? And Mara Loveman, of course, has this fantastic book on the census in Latin America, like all the censuses of Latin America. And one of the things that I found in my work was that, as Diego said, like these decisions are really political, right? So it's not as though census bureaus like look at the demographics of the population and then like objectively try to create categories that reflect those demographics. And, I've seen Dominique Errol in the chat, and the book's excellent as well. So one of the things I found in my book was that, the state makes these decisions on the construction of racial classifications in part because of one, like the racial projects that are already ongoing in countries. So if countries have racial projects that are largely premised on the idea that like race doesn't exist, then of course they're less likely to invest in these types of racial taxonomies, in part because that would go against like the myth making work that the census does. I also found in my work that what mattered was the institutional access points to power. So in some countries, for example, like the US, it's really easy for lobbies to emerge and to lobby representatives to be included in the census for various reasons, or to not be included in the census for various reasons. On the other hand, in places like Canada and the UK, it's actually much harder to get a hold of decision makers who create these racial taxonomies. And so lobbies aren't quite as effective, even if whether they exist or not. So there are these political, as Diego points out, right? There's these real like politics to the creation of these taxonomies. They're never neutral. They always exist kind of in the service of power, whether that's a power that is premised on racial domination, or whether that's a power that's premised on trying to alleviate to some degree the existence of racial inequality in a given country.
Mm-hmm. And another question asked about the kind of transnational framing, that while this race making and ethnicity making is going on at state level and at social level, there are also these kind of broader civilizational narratives about the West, about Europe, about Eurasia, or I guess about the Americas as well. So one audience member was asking about to what extent there are any transnational identity paradigms which you see pulling the debate in one direction or another. And obviously I'm thinking this question for Kimberly, the kind of eternal debate in Russia of the Slavophiles versus the Westerners. I hate bringing that up again and again, but it seems like we never get away from it, because still Russia is that double-headed eagle pointing in two directions. So what's your take on how the kind of spurning of Russia by Europe and now their strategic partnership with China, which is surely bridging a racial divide in the Russian worldview? How do you think those things are playing out under that legacy of the Soviet colorblindness or whatever as well?
I think it is very much like that Janus aspect where it's two different faces. I saw an article, I think a couple of days ago, that was talking about how Russia's been sending COVID supplies to different countries in Africa. It's also working with China. And so what I've been fascinated by recently, especially after the Lincoln Project created an ad that used a lot of, old Soviet, images and did all these crimes against the Cyrillic language, Cyrillic letters. And we see this way in which Russia isn't quite white enough for many Western countries. It cannot claim whiteness in a way like Western Europe can. And I've always been fascinated since I first started studying Russian history in why people weren't comfortable calling Russia European. I've never understood that. And as I've gotten more into my studies and looking at ideas of race, it's because to some point, Russia is white and is Western when it works for Western Europe. And when it isn't behaving in a way such as, you know, sending troops into Crimea, that's when we see Russia portrayed as this Asiatic despotic country, right? And that is what has always interested me. And it's not just Russia. You see this with Ukraine. And when Ukraine's trying to join the EU, it's constantly told not yet, but then Poland's in the EU. So you have these conflicts there. And so, and this is a greater piece that I'd like to work on is the limits to Russian and Ukrainian and just Eastern European whiteness. And how is that defined? It's very temporal. It's also based on, you know, international politics. And right now, Russia is this boogeyman for so many Americans. And so we see these representations, these highly negative and prejudicial representations of Russia and of Russians, or even of Ukrainians, because people in this country a lot don't understand that Ukraine and Russia are two separate countries with, you know, different histories. They loop them all into the same thing that isn't European. And when we talk about, for example, will Russia turn towards Europe or will it go towards what? What is Russia if it's not European, right? These ideas of Asiatic despotism, which is still very much racist in how it's used. And I was reading, I think, in Zakharov's book, and he talks about how the United States and how the West portrayed Soviet leadership. Lenin, you know, he has Asiatic features, and Stalin, well, he's Georgian, he's from the Caucasus. Of course, he acts violently. And to Khrushchev, but when you get to Gorbachev and to Yeltsin, they're a lot more calm with them. Oh, they can be European. They're more welcoming to them. And then Putin, right? How is Putin portrayed? It depends on what we want from Russia at the point. He was our best friend and we're fighting the war on terror, but now he's a despot. He's riding on horseback without a shirt. We're still using these tropes of not being European and thus not being white enough when we discuss Russia. And I think in terms of the legacy of the Soviet Union, I think it very much is because the Soviet Union portrayed itself as a counter to American power and European power, which meant capitalism, colonialism, and racism. And so now, in a very interesting way, now that Russia is no longer that Cold War enemy, and now that Russians are no longer these people we're saving from communism, now in the United States, they're treated as not white enough, not Western enough, not civilized enough. And these are the processes that I think are interesting and that I'm trying to get into more, you know, outside of my main dissertation project, but these are things I'd like to explore.
Yeah, I guess it's a more complicated case than China, where the kind of racial, ethnic, cultural demarcation is kind of a lot more clear cut for most Americans anyway. So it's kind of easier to fit China into that box. I don't know if Diego or Debra want to follow up on this point of the global nesting of national ethnic identities within a broader global narrative of progress or
yeah, I mean, you know, one, as you said just now, I mean, Asia or East Asia, I think would be an interesting, I don't know much about it, but I know that, you know, the construction of racial identities and boundaries there is very different as well. So we should always keep in mind, you know, how, for instance, you know, Korean immigrants in Japan, you know, some people argue that they're racialized, even though for us, Westerners are phenotypically similar. There's an argument to be made that they are racialized. So I think East Asia could be an interesting. So again, I think there's very different ways of organizing race across, especially kind of roughly continental levels. And some of the recent literature about the transnational construction of race that employs some of the ideas of Du Bois, for instance, I think they're interesting. But for, you know, Du Bois, for instance, was not that critical of this, for example, the racism by the Japanese towards Koreans or Chinese. So there was some, in some ways, the transnational model depends on what kind of starting point you use, I think, in order to really understand. So I'm still a little bit cautious in a sense to have a transnational model if we don't know very well how things work in particular kind of at the continental level. So I think, you know, that's something to think about. Even though of course I agree that we should think about it as a global system, but they're so different that you know, these cases that I'm a little bit cautious about, you know, this kind of resurgence of the Du Boisian model for analyzing, because in the end, I mean, Du Bois was also using kind of a U.S. model in some way about the the color line. And so I think we have to think about that critically as well.
Yeah, because Du Bois was impressed by Japan's defeat of the Russian Empire, right? Yeah. So that was like the first time a European power had been pushed back by a non-European power. So,
right.
But I think you make an interesting point. Got back to an earlier discussion about how you separate racial categories from ethnic categories. That I guess in the American tradition we tend to think it's like phenotypical, visible. But what you're saying about Koreans in Japan is it's not necessarily phenotypical. That it's just it's a narrative about descent which plugs into that particular framework, and so it can differ quite fundamentally in different parts of the world. Debra, did you have a comment on this?
I mean, I think so. I've been very concerned. I was trained as a political scientist. I mean, like technically. And I've been very concerned about, like how exactly we compare across different countries or different cases and the racial dynamics, right? And what I found was that, well, one is that in my research, I found that there was like something transnational going on, right? Race was born in the transnational realm. It really did emerge like through the transatlantic slave trade and through colonialism and eventually through the development of these pseudoscientific discourses of race in the 18th and 19th centuries. But I know that like race as a paradigm, racial taxonomies, racism operates differently in different places. Like that's also very clear. And so I think the challenge for social scientists is to find ways to compare, carefully, systematically, without flattening both kind of the local nuances that emerge from this comparison and without dismissing some transnational things that are happening because of, I think, like, again, I believe in the transnational manifestation of race. And like the ways in which I think about this is that race exists on multiple like planes of existence, right? Like race, it can be signified either as being like transnational or hemispheric or local, as I said before, like, the local manifestation of Black identity in like Houston, where Kimberly is, and like Chicago, where I am right now, are very different, right? And so we can think about race as operating on these multiple scales. And so when we compare as social scientists, we need to specify which scales matter in our analyses. And one of the things that I've been working on is not dismissing out of hand the transnational scale because it's harder to see in some ways because those differences between different localities are so real and also so prominent. Yeah.
Okay, we haven't talked much about Europe yet, Western Europe or Eastern Europe, outside of Russia and Ukraine. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because coming originally from Britain, I've seen Britain move a long way in the last 30 years towards being much more inclusive in its national narrative. I'm not saying everything is perfect, far from it, but there's much more of an open debate about multiculturalism and recognition for different communities. Whereas across the channel in France, of course, we've seen a doubling down on a much more integrationist, assimilationist model, where the French identity is, they don't count religion and race in the census, right? They're just saying if you learn to be French and embrace French political values and French culture, you are French. And then in the Netherlands or Germany, we have different variations on those kind of two polar extremes of embracing ethnic diversity and even institutionalizing it in Britain to some extent, versus denying it and trying to erase it in France, at least as a state project. So I'm wondering where you stand on those positions. It seems like this common thread that's coming through of the complexity and that each country is different. But do we see, I don't think anybody would stand up and say, here's the European model and it's working fine.
Yeah.
do you see any general patterns to draw out from the European experience?
Well, I think, not being a super expert on France or other places besides the UK, I find the really interesting thing for me is that whether you look at, the British model of multiculturalism and integration and institutional recognition of race, begrudgingly, or the French Republican model of avoiding it altogether, regardless of those models, we still have like incredible disparities in socioeconomic outcomes of minorities. They're harder to see in France because they refuse to count by race, which is the purpose of counting by race, is to ascertain the extent of racial discrimination, one of the purposes. And so, even these countries in Western Europe, which are so hesitant to talk about race or to count by race or to have any kind of official law or policy that is meant to even mention, racial identities exist. In spite of those hesitancies, we still have like very real circumstances of racial inequality. And we, I think the US is a great example of, even when we talk about race, pretty often, and obviously we still have racial inequality. So, we don't have any good examples anywhere in the world of a country that has successfully eradicated racial inequality. I know that many Canadians think that Canada is a great example. It is not, friends. We just have to look at our Indigenous populations to see like the very real circumstances of racial inequality and ongoing internal colonialism in Canada. So these narratives are really important, right? They shape the ways in which we view race in different contexts. They shape people's like quotidian experiences of racism. And yet, regardless of the variation in the institutionalization of race, we still have very real circumstances of racial inequality.
I guess, Diego, that applies to Latin America as well. I was always struck by the debates around Brazil, for example, that Brazil, the kind of racial democracy, that they never had the kind of legal definition of race and the legal segregation that we had in the US and the one-drop rule and so on. That was absent in Brazil. But even so today, the social outcomes, the stratification, the exploitation by racial category is still there, right? So we see that even though the structures of power are very different, the patterns seem to replicate themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and going back to what you guys were saying, that this French Republican model, the Republic doesn't want to see color, right? In a sense, that was inherited. I mean, that arrived in Latin America early, so just literally from thinkers like Rousseau and other Enlightenment thinkers. Their ideas were applied, which don't really talk about race. Those ideas were applied by Bolivar and others in founding the Republic of Bolivia or Peru, etc. And so race didn't exist. That's why over such a long period of time, racism didn't exist legally either in Latin America when the Republican states existed. And so then you have reactions like in Ecuador and Bolivia that reject the Republican system and say we need something different. And that's where the plurinational state emerges in Ecuador and Bolivia to say, look, there's race, there's racism. There's no one single nationality in Ecuador and Bolivia. So very much the European tradition of colorblind republicanism led to the formation of republics in Latin America. And only literally about 10 years ago, this was rejected. And to say, look, yeah, it retains some of the institutions of republicanism, of course, but the ideology is very different. It's really about color. It's about language, recognition of different languages. But even though those new plurinational models worked for a while, there has been a very strong reaction against them in the last 5-6 years or so. In large part because the leaders behind them, like Morales and Correa, wanted to stay in power for too long. So again, this caudillo element, populism element, has undermined the initial gains of this post-Republican period. So it's going to be interesting to see what will come next, especially countries like Ecuador and Bolivia that, kind of rejected republicanism, then went to plurinationalism, and it's not really clear what's going to happen in the next few years. But I think there's a direct line between European political thought and that colorblind republicanism in the early 1800s in Latin America.
I think that, if I could jump in, I think it's really common to think, building on what Diego said, that, talking about race is itself racist. I encounter this a lot with just like my friends and colleagues and anyone who doesn't, study race regularly and systemically. And it's so backwards, right? Like, talking about race isn't racist in itself, right? And I think that one of the things that we've learned recently is that doing nothing, because racism is entrenched in these institutions and structures, when we do nothing, that simply reifies the racism that already exists, right? So if we choose, for example, to not talk to our children about racism, then they will grow up to be inadvertent racists. Like, that's kind of the way it works. Like, doing nothing will simply continue because institutions are path dependent, and racism is an institution in that way as well, right? Like, doing nothing will simply continue to reify the same circumstances that exist, right? So I think by now we should know that, like, this approach, this colorblind approach, certainly hasn't alleviated racial inequality anywhere.
Yeah, we had a comment from a colleague in Tehran, which I'm very pleased to see, to Tehran, Iran, and he pointed out that as far as he can see in the Middle Eastern world, that for all of the ethnic and cultural and religious strife, that race doesn't seem to be a category that is widely used there to differentiate between the groups. I don't know if any of you have any views on that. That seems accurate enough as far as I can tell. So there are circumstances where race might just kind of drop out of the community building, boundary drawing projects of different political actors.
The only thing I can think of, I was in Iran a few years ago, and one of the things that was very kind of struck me is that what they might see as non-racial language, some of us might see it, for example, the way that Persian culture is described as maybe sometimes superior to Arab culture, for instance. I think from some perspectives, that could be seen as kind of a racialized language, which perhaps isn't seen if you live in Iran. So again, it's not a question of color or of how one appears, but discussion about language, culture, that can also be racialized, aspects of racialization.
I mean, I don't know a whole lot about the way race is operationalized in the various countries in the Middle East, but I do certainly know that the way in which the international system has often treated people and entities from the Middle East, like, kind of smacks of racism. The entire colonial enterprise was about ideas of white supremacy and civilizational superiority. And certainly the way that people of Middle Eastern descent are treated in countries like Canada and the United States, like, are highly racialized.
Sure. So certainly the interaction with Europe was highly racialized. No question about that. But I guess the legacy is not necessarily structuring the inside the countries right now. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have like 5 minutes left, so I'd like to give each of our panelists the opportunity to sum up if they have any closing thoughts. And I'd also like to mention to our audience before people start logging off that there is a call for papers for the ASN Journal Nationalities papers on the theme of nationalism and racial hierarchies. This is a future issue to be guest edited by Bridget Coggins, Coggins, from UC Santa Barbara. So if anybody out there in our audience wants to, is working on this and would like to take part in that special issue, please contact the editor, Harris Malonas, or the special issue editor, Bridget Coggins. So we can go in reverse order again. So start off maybe with Diego as the first concluding comments.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's been very interesting. I think, look, again, it's really important to have a very different perspective. That's the first takeaway for me, is that to understand race, we have to think about the former Soviet Union, Russia, Canada, UK, Latin America. We shouldn't think of only the US. Again, that's really a big takeaway from this, is that, and if we do move away from those traditional paradigms of the US or Western Europe, I think a lot of things become much more clear. In my field of political theory, I think that's pretty much the case, because in political philosophy, very few European thinkers really think about race seriously. So we have to look outside those bounds, and that's what comparative political theory is about. I think we are in a moment now in which all these elements that we thought maybe we had gone past, I mean, race, nationalism, they're coming back. So we have to really think about it from a different perspective. The U.S. is, in a sense, at the forefront of that, of this resurgence. So I think, especially for political scientists, as Debra said, my training is also as a political scientist. My own personal take is that political science kind of lags behind sociology, anthropology, history, perhaps, in really understanding in a very deep way what race is, beyond simply a kind of independent variable, in a sense. So we have to be much more critical of that within political science. But again, simply to say that we need this dialogue of history, sociology, political theory, political science, because race is a concept that's really kind of multi-sided. It's something that cannot really be understood only from one side, I guess.
Right, thank you. And Kimberly?
To piggyback off what Diego said, I think the panel speaks to the need for a interdisciplinary approach to understanding race and racism, but also we need a diversity in academia to actually address these issues. Especially, it's really easy for people who do not experience racial oppression to never think about that. So why would that influence your work? So what got me into my current research was, after I came back from Ukraine, I wanted to see if there were more people like me who'd ever been to the post-Soviet space, right? And so I think that if we want to see more fruitful conversations and we want to produce work that actually starts to address these questions, we have to also address some of the inequities within the academy and within how we teach and approach students who are interested in these things, so we can get better ways to deal with these issues. And I saw that a lot of the questions for me may not have been answered, so they can always reach out to me and I'll happily answer them. But thank you for listening to us.
Great. And Debra?
Yeah, thanks to everyone for tuning in, and thanks to Diego and Kimberly and Peter as well, of course, for moderating. I don't have much to say to sum up, other than that, we're in just an unprecedented moment. COVID-19 and the rise of Black Lives Matter, just everything about this moment feels so different. Who knows what the American election in November will bring. I think it's going to be a bit of a disaster, frankly, in terms of voter suppression, or just a lack of access to the polls in many places. And these things are shifting under our feet. And so I think it's important to pay attention, to not be fooled by easy answers. And to continue to learn, which is to say that all of this stuff that I've learned about race and how to conceptualize racism, like, I had to teach myself. And so if I can learn about this, then you people listening are certainly capable of learning about it too, and passing this information along to our students and the future generations. So maybe we can do a little bit better.
Great. So thanks, everybody. And bear in mind that there's a continuing series of virtual ASN webinars. So check the website roughly every 2 weeks. We'll take a break over the summer probably, but certainly start again at the end of August. So goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Wow, it's we managed. Oh, it looks like we lost.
All right, Peter, I
Yeah.
stopped Facebook recording.
Mm-hmm.
We still have some attendees who are leaving right now, and I will be sending out an email shortly.
Okay.
All of you, okay, will be rejoining in a different format.
Okay.
I am ending the Zoom for everyone right now. So all the attendees and participants, this is the official end of this webinar.